듣기만 해도 저절로 외워지는 주어, 동사 100문장. 고양이가 가르랑거린다.
The cat purrs. The cat purrs. The cat purrs.
개가 짖는다.
The dog barks. The dog barks. The dog barks.
태양이 빛난다.
The sun shines. The sun shines. The sun shines.
꽃이 핀다.
The flowers bloom. The flowers bloom. The flowers bloom.
아기가 운다.
The baby cries. The baby cries. The baby cries.
새들이 노래한다.
The birds sing. The birds sing. The birds sing.
물이 흐른다.
The water flows. The water flows. The water flows.
바람이 분다.
The wind blows. The wind blows. The wind blows.
차가 경적을 울린다.
The car honks. The car honks. The car honks.
전화벨이 울린다.
The phone rings. The phone rings. The phone rings.
아이가 웃는다.
The child laughs. The child laughs. The child laughs.
선생님이 가르친다.
The teacher teaches. The teacher teaches. The teacher teaches.
학생이 공부한다.
The student studies. The student studies. The student studies.
셰프가 요리한다.
The chef cooks. The chef cooks. The chef cooks.
의사가 치료한다.
The doctor heals. The doctor heals. The doctor heals.
작가는 쓴다.
The writer writes. The writer writes. The writer writes.
예술가는 창조한다.
The artist creates. The artist creates. The artist creates.
선수가 달린다.
The athlete runs. The athlete runs. The athlete runs.
댄서가 춤을 춥니다.
The dancer dances. The dancer dances. The dancer dances.
음악가가 연주합니다.
The musician plays. The musician plays. The musician plays.
배우가 연기한다.
The actor performs. The actor performs. The actor performs.
과학자는 실험을 한다.
The scientist conducts experiments. The scientist conducts experiments. The scientist conducts experiments.
엔지니어가 설계합니다.
The engineer designs. The engineer designs. The engineer designs.
농부는 땅을 경작한다.
The farmer cultivates the land. The farmer cultivates the land. The farmer cultivates the land.
조종사는 비행기를 조종한다.
The pilot flies the plane. The pilot flies the plane. The pilot flies the plane.
선장은 배를 항해한다.
The captain sails the ship. The captain sails the ship. The captain sails the ship.
경찰관이 순찰한다.
The police officer patrols. The police officer patrols. The police officer patrols.
소방관은 불을 끈다.
The firefighter extinguishes fires. The firefighter extinguishes fires. The firefighter extinguishes fires.
군인은 방어한다.
The soldier defends. The soldier defends. The soldier defends.
요리사가 식사를 준비합니다.
The chef prepares a meal. The chef prepares a meal. The chef prepares a meal.
정원사는 꽃을 심습니다.
The gardener plants flowers. The gardener plants flowers. The gardener plants flowers.
출납원은 거래를 처리합니다.
The cashier handles transactions. The cashier handles transactions. The cashier handles transactions.
접수원이 손님을 맞이합니다.
The receptionist greets guests. The receptionist greets guests. The receptionist greets guests.
사서는 책을 정리한다.
The librarian organizes books. The librarian organizes books. The librarian organizes books.
배관공은 파이프를 고친다.
The plumber fixes pipes. The plumber fixes pipes. The plumber fixes pipes.
전기 기술자가 배선을 설치합니다.
The electrician installs wiring. The electrician installs wiring. The electrician installs wiring.
정비사는 차를 수리한다.
The mechanic repairs cars. The mechanic repairs cars. The mechanic repairs cars.
제빵사가 빵을 굽는다.
The baker bakes bread. The baker bakes bread. The baker bakes bread.
바리스타가 커피를 끓인다.
The barista brews coffee. The barista brews coffee. The barista brews coffee.
기자가 뉴스를 보도한다.
The journalist reports news. The journalist reports news. The journalist reports news.
사진사는 사진을 찍는다.
The photographer takes photos. The photographer takes photos. The photographer takes photos.
디자이너는 디자인을 만든다.
The designer creates designs. The designer creates designs. The designer creates designs.
회계사는 재정을 관리한다.
The accountant manages finances. The accountant manages finances. The accountant manages finances.
컨설턴트가 조언합니다.
The consultant advises. The consultant advises. The consultant advises.
치료사는 치료를 제공합니다.
The therapist provides therapy. The therapist provides therapy. The therapist provides therapy.
코치는 선수들을 훈련시킨다.
The coach trains athletes. The coach trains athletes. The coach trains athletes.
인명구조원은 수영하는 사람을 감시합니다.
The lifeguard watches over swimmers. The lifeguard watches over swimmers. The lifeguard watches over swimmers.
인명구조원이 수영하는 사람을 구조한다.
The lifeguard rescues swimmers. The lifeguard rescues swimmers. The lifeguard rescues swimmers.
간호사는 환자를 돌본다.
The nurse cares for patients. The nurse cares for patients. The nurse cares for patients.
약사가 약을 조제한다.
The pharmacist dispenses medication. The pharmacist dispenses medication. The pharmacist dispenses medication.
치과 의사는 치아를 치료한다.
The dentist treats teeth. The dentist treats teeth. The dentist treats teeth.
검안사는 눈을 검사합니다.
The optometrist examines eyes. The optometrist examines eyes. The optometrist examines eyes.
수의사는 동물을 치료한다.
The veterinarian treats animals. The veterinarian treats animals. The veterinarian treats animals.
선생님은 학생들을 교육시킨다.
The teacher educates students. The teacher educates students. The teacher educates students.
교장은 학교를 이끈다.
The principal leads the school. The principal leads the school. The principal leads the school.
CEO는 회사를 총괄한다.
The CEO oversees the company. The CEO oversees the company. The CEO oversees the company.
관리자는 직원을 감독합니다.
The manager supervises employees. The manager supervises employees. The manager supervises employees.
고객 서비스 담당자는 고객을 지원합니다.
The customer service representative assists customers. The customer service representative assists customers. The customer service representative assists customers.
영업사원은 제품을 판매합니다.
The salesperson sells products. The salesperson sells products. The salesperson sells products.
마케팅 담당자는 브랜드를 홍보합니다.
The marketer promotes brands. The marketer promotes brands. The marketer promotes brands.
변호사는 고객을 대변합니다.
The lawyer represents clients. The lawyer represents clients. The lawyer represents clients.
판사는 재판을 주재한다.
The judge presides over court cases. The judge presides over court cases. The judge presides over court cases.
탐정은 범죄를 수사한다.
The detective investigates crimes. The detective investigates crimes. The detective investigates crimes.
치료사는 내담자의 말을 경청합니다.
The therapist listens to clients. The therapist listens to clients. The therapist listens to clients.
코치는 선수들에게 동기를 부여한다.
The coach motivates athletes. The coach motivates athletes. The coach motivates athletes.
멘토는 멘티를 인도한다.
The mentor guides mentees. The mentor guides mentees. The mentor guides mentees.
컨설턴트는 데이터를 분석합니다.
The consultant analyzes data. The consultant analyzes data. The consultant analyzes data.
연구자는 실험을 한다.
The researcher conducts experiments. The researcher conducts experiments. The researcher conducts experiments.
과학자는 현상을 관찰한다.
The scientist observes phenomena. The scientist observes phenomena. The scientist observes phenomena.
분석가는 데이터를 해석합니다.
The analyst interprets data. The analyst interprets data. The analyst interprets data.
운전자가 차량을 운전합니다.
The driver operates the vehicle. The driver operates the vehicle. The driver operates the vehicle.
자전거 타는 사람이 자전거 페달을 밟습니다.
The cyclist pedals the bike. The cyclist pedals the bike. The cyclist pedals the bike.
수영 선수는 랩을 수영합니다.
The swimmer swims laps. The swimmer swims laps. The swimmer swims laps.
주자는 조깅한다.
The runner jogs. The runner jogs. The runner jogs.
등산객은 트레일을 하이킹합니다.
The hiker hikes trails. The hiker hikes trails. The hiker hikes trails.
등반 가는 산을 오른다.
The climber scales mountains. The climber scales mountains. The climber scales mountains.
스키어는 슬로프를 내려갑니다.
The skier skis down the slope. The skier skis down the slope. The skier skis down the slope.
스노보더는 스노보드를 탄다.
The snowboarder rides the snowboard. The snowboarder rides the snowboard. The snowboarder rides the snowboard.
서퍼는 파도를 잡는다.
The surfer catches waves. The surfer catches waves. The surfer catches waves.
다이버는 수중 탐험을 한다.
The diver explores underwater. The diver explores underwater. The diver explores underwater.
여행자는 새로운 목적지를 탐색한다.
The traveler explores new destinations. The traveler explores new destinations. The traveler explores new destinations.
탐험가는 새로운 땅을 발견한다.
The explorer discovers new lands. The explorer discovers new lands. The explorer discovers new lands.
독자는 책을 읽는다.
The reader reads a book. The reader reads a book. The reader reads a book.
작가는 원고를 편집한다.
The writer edits a manuscript. The writer edits a manuscript. The writer edits a manuscript.
가수는 무대에서 공연한다.
The singer performs on stage. The singer performs on stage. The singer performs on stage.
무용수는 공연을 위해 리허설을 한다.
The dancer rehearses for a show. The dancer rehearses for a show. The dancer rehearses for a show.
배우는 대사를 외운다.
The actor memorizes lines. The actor memorizes lines. The actor memorizes lines.
음악가는 악기를 연습한다.
The musician practices an instrument. The musician practices an instrument. The musician practices an instrument.
작가는 캔버스를 그린다.
The artist paints a canvas. The artist paints a canvas. The artist paints a canvas.
조각가는 점토를 빚는다.
The sculptor molds clay. The sculptor molds clay. The sculptor molds clay.
목수는 가구를 만든다.
The carpenter builds furniture. The carpenter builds furniture. The carpenter builds furniture.
건축가는 건물을 설계한다.
The architect designs buildings. The architect designs buildings. The architect designs buildings.
엔지니어는 다리를 건설합니다.
The engineer constructs bridges. The engineer constructs bridges. The engineer constructs bridges.
건설 노동자는 중장비를 조작한다.
The construction worker operates heavy machinery. The construction worker operates heavy machinery. The construction worker operates heavy machinery.
배관공이 막힌 파이프를 뚫습니다.
The plumber unclogs pipes. The plumber unclogs pipes. The plumber unclogs pipes.
전기 기술자는 전기 시스템을 수리합니다.
The electrician repairs electrical systems. The electrician repairs electrical systems. The electrician repairs electrical systems.
관리인이 건물을 청소합니다.
The janitor cleans the building. The janitor cleans the building. The janitor cleans the building.
정원사는 울타리를 다듬습니다.
The gardener trims hedges. The gardener trims hedges. The gardener trims hedges.
농부는 농작물을 수확한다.
The farmer harvests crops. The farmer harvests crops. The farmer harvests crops.
노동자는 육체적인 일을 한다.
The laborer performs physical tasks. The laborer performs physical tasks. The laborer performs physical tasks.